Hello everyone and welcome to our third lecture in our combined units over chapters 21 and 22. In this lecture we're going to take a look at England and what happened during the age of absolutism in Great Britain. So let's get started. Alright, so let's set the stage a little bit. We've talked about England a little bit over the last couple of chapters regarding what they've done against like the Spanish and what they've done in the Americas. But now we're going to actually focus on what actually happens in England itself. All right. So traditionally in England, if you go back and look at their history, we see the monarchs are actually going to squabble or argue with Parliament quite a bit. Usually it's over money. I mean, that's kind of most of the arguments that are actually going to happen between monarchs and any form of elected bodies really at any point in history. But for the sake of England, this is kind of the big thing. It's always about money. Now, Parliament has power of the purse or the power of money over the monarchs, and this actually keeps the monarchs of England, whoever you're talking about, from actually having absolute power. So that's actually a good thing to kind of keep some balance. Now, there's going to be some issues that are going to help set the stage for what's going to happen in England in the years following or the years progressing through this lecture. So Elizabeth I, she dies in 1603. She has no son. Okay, so there's going to be a power struggle in terms of who's actually going to take the throne. So James Stuart, who's the King of Scotland, assumes the throne. He becomes James I. Okay, and he becomes a shared ruler between Scotland and England. And that's important because this is, again, another step towards a united kingdom, or Great Britain, if you will. All right, so now James I is going to fight with Parliament over money and over reforms with the Puritans. He's actually going to refuse those. And that's pretty much going to be his rule. There's a lot more to it, but we don't have a lot of time for this course, for another course. Now, his son, Charles I, who you see here, takes over in 1625. There's a problem. Okay, he always needs money because England is fighting wars with Spain and France. Whether it's little conflicts overseas or particularly on the continent of Europe. Now, Parliament is going to refuse Charles I's request for money several times. So what Charles does is he just says, you know what, I'm going to get rid of Parliament. So he dissolves this elected body because he wants his money. You can actually kind of look at this kind of some similarities to King John back in the age of like the Magna Carta and so forth. Now, Charles dissolves Parliament to try to get his money, but it turns out that he's not going to be all that successful, and he actually needs Parliament just a few years later. And Parliament decides to come back, but they only come back after Charles signs what's going to be known as the Petition of Right. And basically, what do they agree to in that? There's not going to be imprisonment of subjects without cause, so you have to actually have cause to imprison somebody. He can't issue taxes without Parliament's consent and agreeing to those taxes that will be issued. No soldiers can be forcibly quartered at homes, and there's no martial law that's going to be put in place during peacetime. So as long as there's no war going on, you can't declare martial law. Now, these are big curbs against his power, kind of restricting him from being absolute ruler. Also, if you take a look at these guys and you're familiar with the United States Bill of Rights, you should see some similarities here with what is going on in terms of these rights. There's a reason why these exist, even in the U.S. Constitution today. There's a connection here. We'll take a look at that in class. All right, so the petition basically says, look, the law is bigger than the king. So it doesn't matter if it's the king, doesn't matter if it's Parliament or the lowliest subject, you have to follow the law. Everybody has to go underneath it, or underneath the law itself. Now, Charles, he agrees to it, but then he actually ignores the petition, dissolves Parliament again, and starts taxing the people. And as you can probably tell, his popularity is going to fall, and it's going to fall very quickly. All right. So just a reminder to you guys, this is the Parliament building in England. Most everybody's like, oh, it's Big Ben because of the clock tower. This is actually the entire complex is for Parliament. All right, so what's going to happen is ultimately all these events by Charles is going to lead to a civil war. So kind of the last straw is Charles angers the northern kingdom that's part of Great Britain. Scotland, and Scotland starts to plan an invasion of England. So Charles comes in and says, look, we need money. He needs Parliament. Okay, he'd already dissolved them for a second time. So essentially what happens is a few years later, 1641-42, Parliament restricts power of the monarchy even further. Charles is angry with this. He sees that he's in a bad position. He actually flees to London and flees from London, and forms an army in the northern part of England. Okay, and this starts what's going to be known as the English Civil War. And basically the two sides are Charles I, who's leading the Royalists or the Cavaliers, depending on what you want to call them, and then the Parliament's forces or the Puritan forces or the Puritans. If you guys take a look at this map, you're actually going to get something similar to this on your test. And you can see the red areas are the forces of Charles, the Royalists, and then the green areas are the forces controlled by, or the areas controlled by the Parliamentarians or the Puritans. All right, so the English Civil War is actually a really slow developing war. It's not something that you would look at and be like, oh, there's events happening all the time. It's actually quite slow for a variety of reasons. Again, we don't have a lot of time in this course, and that's for another course to get into those. But it is a slow developing war. Now, the big changing and turning point of the war is going to be done by Oliver Cromwell. When he takes command of the forces of Parliament, or the Puritans, he's actually going to train their army up and form what's going to be known as the New Model Army. It's a well-trained, well-disciplined force, and they're going to turn the tide of the war. Now, in 1647, Charles I is defeated and actually captured by the forces of Parliament. And what will happen is in 1649, after he's jailed for a couple of years, he's going to be put on trial. And Charles I is going to be put on trial for treason against the English state, and he's going to be executed. And this is significant, and it's not going to be the last time, but it's going to be the first time a monarch was publicly put on trial and executed. Okay, and you're going to see this actually theme play out here over the next 100, 150 years or so, where that's going to become more commonplace, especially when we get to the French Revolution. All right, so let's talk about Oliver Cromwell for a second. So Oliver Cromwell leads the forces of Parliament. But in 1649, after victory, he abolishes the monarchy in total, as well as the House of Lords. So there's only one House of Parliament left under what Cromwell. And he essentially creates what is going to be known as a Commonwealth or Republic. At least in name, that's what it's going to be. And he starts passing laws promoting puritanical ideas and religious toleration. Okay, now throughout his rule, it's going to be pretty much like him running England like a dictator, even though it's technically a republic. There is going to be a constitution that's drafted in 1653, which is important because it's going to be the first modern constitution developed in Europe. And he even goes on to crush rebellion in Ireland, and then he starts giving land that's taken from this the rebellious forces in Ireland. He starts giving it to his soldiers. And this is going to continue a rivalry that's going to develop between the English and the Irish, and ultimately lead to that rivalry between the division of Northern Ireland and Ireland itself. That'll play itself out a little bit later as well. All right, now we're going to move on to another revolution in England, but basically let's kind of get the years in between to gap between what we've talked about with Oliver Cromwell and what's going to be known as the Glorious Revolution. So in 1659, Parliament comes back together and they appoint Charles II to rule. Okay, so this is the restoration. It's restoring the monarchy to lead England. Now, that's important because that's putting the monarchy back together, obviously. But then Parliament starts to do other things. They start to pass more things based on rights, more laws based on rights, such as habeas corpus, which is the right to face a judge for charges brought against you. Very important right, something we have here in America as well. Now, Charles II is going to rule for quite some time. Then James II, his brother, is going to become king in 1685. He's actually going to start to offend the majority of subjects, which are Protestant, and he's Catholic. So you have a religious difference there between the leadership and the majority of people in England. So ultimately what this is going to lead to is a very unique revolution in history, especially considering what has been going on in Europe and going on quite some time in terms of bloodshed. You actually have the Glorious Revolution in 1688, where Queen Mary and William of Orange, who are both Protestant, overthrow James II, the Catholic leader, and he flees to France. So you actually have a change in power, a revolution that's completely bloodless, at least for the most part. And that's why it's called the Glorious Revolution. All right, now we're going to talk about briefly a little bit of the limitations that exist within the rulership of England. So what happens is William and Mary, they actually come to the throne. They do something that the other rulers before them really didn't do, or at least they didn't necessarily really stick to. They actually recognize Parliament fully and agree to a complete constitutional monarchy, in that Parliament will have control of certain things, the monarchy will have control of certain things, and they work together and they base it off of a constitution. Not a fully written one, but a constitution nonetheless. So what's going to be adapted at this time is the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights. And just a couple of things that are agreed to in the English Bill of Rights is that monarch can't suspend Parliament's laws, there's no levying of taxes without consent, and you can't interfere in freedom of speech, as well as no penalty for any grievances that are actually put forth in a formal manner. These are important because the English Bill of Rights is actually going to be a precursor to the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights. And we'll actually take a look at those, like I mentioned earlier, and compare the two documents. All right, and then we have in the 1700s, there's a cabinet that's developed within the English government system to help pass laws. And this is just a group of officials. They work pretty much in the same way as the cabinet does for the U.S. president. And they provide a link between the monarchy and Parliament and help with policy making and advice. But ultimately, you have to understand, it's not the king or the queen in England that's actually going to be the ruler after the setup of the constitutional monarchy. Yes, they're a ruler, they do a lot of things, important figure, but really the person that's the true leader after this point is the prime minister, an elected official. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed this one on England during the age of absolutism and all that stuff. And I will see you guys in the next one when we transition to the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. I'll see you in the next one.